in that becoming a world language instructor is no fast track either to fame or to riches. It's to be assumed that both you and I have pursued that profession because we have a conviction about the richness that the ability to speak a second or a third language has brought to our own lives. We learn to express ourselves in a new language, and consequently, that ability opened up for us a world of perspectives and a world of experiences that we never would have had otherwise. In my particular case, I learned the rudiments of French while I was in school. And that enabled me to interact with people in France whom I never would have known otherwise. First as a high school exchange student, then later on in college, and then finally for 13 years as an adult living in France with my family. During those years in France, I served as an assistant pastor of a church, and to provide for my family, I worked as an English teacher for the Chamber of Commerce in industry, also with the general public. I also at one point began an importing business, importing sporting goods into France and distributing them throughout France. And believe it or not, at one point ran a 125-member baseball club in the far north of France. And yes, indeed, baseball is played in France. You can check that website if you'd like confirmation of that fact. Each of these roles and the simple fact of everyday life in France gave me a wealth of experiences and the opportunity to influence others and to be influenced by others that I never would have had I not learned French in the first place. For example, as an assistant pastor, I occasionally had the opportunity to preach and to teach within our church, and I remember on one occasion preaching on the sanctity of marriage and having a couple come to me several months later who had simply been living together and determined that they would get married because of the message that I'd preached that day. On another occasion, I taught on the topic of the blessedness of children, and a couple that had already had 2 or 3 children, they came to me later and said to me that they'd chosen to have another child simply because of the impact that message had on them on that particular day. On another occasion, I was involved in breaking up a car theft at the base of our apartment building. And I have to say that the ability to speak both accurately and very rapidly in a pressure-filled situation may well have been the difference between life and death on that occasion. I also remember speaking to the Assemblée Générale, which is the annual meeting of our baseball club. 125 young people were there along with their fathers. And I shared with them a story about my own father and how he had played in a father-son baseball game with me when I was a 12-year-old boy, even though he was extremely uncomfortable playing sports and was very not in the kind of physical condition that one should be to perform in a sport. But he did it because he loved me. He did it because he wanted to be involved in my life. And I just shared with those fathers how important it is that they not be passive, that they be actively engaged in the life of their children. Well, I mention all those experiences to you because they're indelibly printed in my memory. They enriched my life, and they would not have been possible had I not been able to speak French. And I'm sure that you as well have similar memories of rich experiences you've had that were tied to your ability to relate to someone in a language other than your native language. That's really what we covet for our students, isn't it? That's what we ultimately desire for our students, that they themselves would find their lives enriched by similar kinds of experiences. However, if we're honest, if we take a sober look at the language students that American schools are turning out, we have to recognize that there's a problem. What kind of problem? Well, let me put it this way. When I speak with people at the university level regarding the kinds of limitations they observe in incoming freshman language students, they speak of 3 areas of deficiency: listening comprehension, oral expression, and authentic pronunciation. The students struggle to understand and even resent instructors who deliver an entire course in the target language. Those same students can analyze grammar and write with some success, but They have great difficulty actually speaking the language they've spent years studying while in high school and in middle school. And when they do so, they make statements that are depressingly steeped in a heavy American accent. Now, merely saying that their high school language studies do not provide them with sufficient oral practice is really not looking deeply enough into the root cause of the problem. Ultimately, these students' deficiencies were not caused by mere lack of oral emphasis in their high school courses, but rather by the manner in which their instructors trained them to think as those instructors presented to them their new language for the first time. In short, and this is more true and more critical in the first year of instruction than at any other point in a student's learning, the problem is that their initial instruction was text-based in nature. Vocabulary and grammar were presented to them in written form, or at best in tandem with images, training the students to first fall back on reflection on the printed word before they would express themselves orally. In the worst cases, not only did they fall back on an inner envisioning of the printed word, but they also passed their concepts through the grid of their native language before they would begin to express themselves. Let me make this very clear. How can teachers recognize if they are engaging in text-based instruction? Simply put, if we are conveying meaning by means of printed text prior to our students attaining relative oral fluency, then we are engaging in text-based instruction. Now, what I mean by relative oral fluency, I'll explain that more in detail in a future video. But for right now, what I'd like to do is just explain why text-based instruction is so damaging. Now, the ultimate problem with printed text is that it is frozen in time. Now, a language student would say, so much the better. Having the time to reflect on the appearance, the meaning, to hypothesize a pronunciation when the word is in printed form and you can reflect upon it at great length, seems ideal, as opposed to walking up to someone on a street corner in Lille, France, for example, and having them say to you, "Et vous avez du feu?" And you have to analyze the sounds to determine what is this person asking of me. That is a pressure-filled situation. That requires a much higher level of skill than what reading and reflecting on printed text requires. Printed text is frozen in time, and students have the leisure to reflect on it at great length. During their reflection, they're probably doing three things. They're memorizing its spelling. They're looking at the word to try and find some connection between it and their native language, which will allow them to remember the word. And in the worst case, if a translation of that word is provided by the curriculum, they're seeking to memorize the association between the new word and what they think is the equivalent term in their own language. What's the consequence of text-based transmission of meaning? It results in the cultivating within the student a destructive 5-step thought process, whereas native speech, native language expression occurs in just 2 steps. The 5 steps are as follows. Students have a thought existing in the form of a mental image, first of all. Secondly, the student assigns words in their native language to that image.
I'm hungry.
They next envision those words inwardly in the form of printed text. Then they envision what they believe are equivalent terms, usually in the form of a word-to-word translation in the target language. And number 5, finally, they verbalize the statement in the target language, likely doing so with a heavy American accent as they apply the English phonics system to the printed text that they're inwardly envisioning.
Soy hambre.
Now, steps 2 and 3, which involve thinking first in terms of their native language and then envisioning those words in terms of printed text are necessary because this is the means of access that we as instructors have given them to the target language and that has been drilled into them through the mode by which we have conveyed meaning to them in the new language. Okay, trabajar. Trabajar, let's see.
Él trabaja en el jardín.
El trabaja en el jardín. El trabaja en el jardín. He works in the garden. El trabaja en el jardín. This looks like an office.
Él trabaja en la oficina.
Yep. El trabaja en la oficina. El trabaja en la was it off or oficina? Oficina. And
Él trabaja en la escuela.
El trabaja. Stop it. Stop it. El trabaja en la escuela. Escuela is a school, yeah. He works in the school. Okay. Now, trabajar. Trabajar is work. Work. How to remember that? Trabajar. Travel? No. This is hard. Working is hard, so trabajar is hard. Trabajar is work, because it's hard to remember. Okay. Now, let me get this here. Trabajar. Trabajar is to work. And then jardín is garden. And then oficina is office. And then escuela is school.
Guillermo, ¿trabaja tu padre en una escuela?
Trabaja. That was that work. It was work. Trabajar is to work. So, yo trabajo en...
No, Guillermo, tu padre. ¿Trabaja tu padre en una escuela?
Escuela. Escuela is a school. So, trabaja tu padre en una escuela? Oh, does your dad work in a school? Oh, sí. Mi padre trabaja? Yeah. Mi padre trabaja en una escuela. En una escuela.
Muy bien, Guillermo.
Step 4 is rendered necessary if meaning was conveyed by means of translation, for sure, but it's also rendered likely, even without a background of translation, if the meaning of words was derived after a lengthy reflection on the word in printed form. The result of this unwieldy 5-step thought process is that students who have received their initial instruction by means of a text-based mode, they speak in a slow, halting, awkward manner, with speech which is often unintelligible to the native speaker and sometimes even embarrassing in its unintended content. By contrast to this thought process, a native speaker is trained through experience to think in a 2-step sequence, going directly from the level of concepts and images to their verbalization in the target language, without the need to pass their thoughts through the grid of printed text or of a second language. Am I imagining the harm that we're doing to our world language students by taking what I consider the easy way out, that is by tying their learning to text-based curriculum and pedagogy, by requiring written work of them before a sound oral foundation has been laid in their minds? Well, don't ask me. Obviously, I'm biased. Ask the college professors who inherit the product of our labor. And remember, they're likely only to see the cream of the crop for the most part when it comes to the students who spent years studying a language in middle school and in high school. Those professors will confirm the reality with which I started this video, that reality of their students speaking and understanding with great difficulty and pronouncing inauthentically. All 3 of those deficiencies are the result of one fundamental weakness in our pedagogy, the conveying of meaning by means of printed text, and the reinforcement of the unwieldy thought process engendered by a premature exposure to the written language. Awkward speech is the product of having trained our students to precede their speech by passing their thoughts through the grid of their native language and the written word. Poor listening comprehension is simply the result of that same five-step process in reverse order, run in reverse order through the students' minds. Inauthentic pronunciation comes from training students to think of words initially in terms of their spellings, resulting in the students inevitably applying the English phonics system to those words before the authentic pronunciation was ever established as the norm for the pronunciation of that word. The natural language learning approach, which prepares the way for fluent speech, does not initially convey meaning via the written word, but rather in a visual, image-laden environment. Failing to respect this reality condemns our students to ultimate failure, unless a later extended overseas stay, as was the case in my life, allows them to undo the damage done through our initial instruction. One summer, I brought my French baseball team to the United States to compete against American high school teams in my native Michigan. Now, it just so happened that my first baseman, whom my family was going to host here in the States, was the son of Le Préfet du Nord, the prefect of the north of France, a man appointed by the President of France to govern the north of the country. In other words, this is no small individual of little influence. First, however, before I could host his son in our home, I was invited to the prefect's home within the prefecture to meet him and undoubtedly to be evaluated as to whether or not I was someone trustworthy enough to take his son overseas. As I climbed the marble steps to his apartment, the same steps I once saw Princess Diana climb during a visit to the prefecture as they discussed the anticipated Channel Tunnel, I knew that I could not afford to stammer, to search for my words, to struggle to understand the prefect, and to pronounce his language, as the French would say, comme une vache espagnole, like a Spanish cow. Otherwise, my trustworthiness, rightly or wrongly, would probably be called into question. Well, experiences like that, like those I relayed to you at the beginning of this video, they're rich, they're indelibly recorded in our memory, and they should belong to our students as well as they have belonged to you and me. Can we justifiably rob our students of such moments, of such memories, because our attachment to a failed traditional methodology, just because those methods are the easy way out and the way things have always been done? Do we have the right to rob our students of the potential of genuine fluency as we train them to think in a manner which is inconsistent with fluent speech? The acquisition of genuine oral fluency in a second language is never easy, but it's eminently worthwhile. So, how do we convey meaning in a visual fashion and doing it without the use of the printed word? Well, that will be the subject of my next video, and I certainly hope you'll be able to join me.